Did you know that running all services on one server is not recommended? You should have different servers depending on what their function is or what you're using it for. For instance, you can have one domain controller, you could have one web server, you could have one file server, and so on and so forth. Now, the thing is that buying physical servers has a cost to it. But if you buy one a little bigger server, you can do the same with virtualization. Now, in this example, we're going to use Hyper-V simply because it's a part of Windows. And if you're running Windows Server, it's the one that I would recommend. You can use another one called VMware, which is also probably the leader in virtualization. But the thing is that if you run VMware, you have to license every virtual server, and if you have a lot of Windows servers, it's gonna get expensive fast. But if you do run Windows in the core as the base operating system and Hyper-V, you can actually license 2 virtual machines with Windows from one host, or licensing one host. You can run 2 virtual machines. Now, if you have a lot of Linux, for instance, you could have, well, you don't necessarily need to license them since it's open source, so you can have multiple of them. Now, I don't want to say downside, but the thing with Windows is that if you run Hyper-V, you can run 2 virtual machines on a standard license. Then you have to buy more licenses to be able to, or to be allowed to run more virtual machines. Now, the license isn't going to stop you from running several virtual machines, but if Microsoft finds out that you are running, say, 3 virtual machines and you only have license for 2 virtual machines, well, then you will probably get a nasty bill. But the license itself isn't limiting you. So it's a gentleman agreement, or how to say. But to do this, first of all, we're gonna install Windows Server. I have my old PC, my old gaming computer, that I'm gonna install Windows Server for this occasion, just to demonstrate. I won't be keeping the Windows Server on it because it's a PC. I'm gonna use it for other stuff. But anyway, what you first want to do is you want to prepare a USB or something that you can boot from. In my instance, I have the Kingston Data Traveler 2.0. So the first thing you want to do is you want to boot the PC or server, if you have a actual server, from the USB stick. And then you want to install Windows Server. You want to make sure you have the language correct, set to English, not something else. English, always English. The only time that I accept that you use another language for the operating system on a server is if it's a terminal server. That's the only time, because users can have other languages, but administrators should have English, because all the documentation and everything is based on English. So if you have an operating system that does not have English, things get a lot more complicated. Anyway, you want to make sure the time and currency format are correct, the keyboard or input method is correct. So I'm gonna go with Swedish, of course, because I'm a Swede living in Sweden, but the language is still English. Then you want to move on. For this instance, I'm gonna choose Windows Server 2019 Data Center Desktop Experience. You can run standard, and you can run the one without desktop experience, but we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for now, we're using desktop experience. You want to accept the license agreement, and you want to choose a custom. Now, I have 3 disks in this PC, so I want to take the disk that I want to use, which is drive 2. I want to delete that partition since I won't be using it, and I've already cleaned everything that I need from the disk, so it's safe to delete. And you want to accept the warning, and then you'll get a drive to unallocated space. You want to mark that one and choose next, and then it installs the operating system. Now this is just a basic install, nothing fancy or anything, and it restarts. In my case, since I have several disks, I need to go into BIOS and make sure that it boots from the right disk, because if it boots from the wrong disk, then I get into Windows 10, which I don't want for this to work. So I'm going to change the disk, save the configuration, and reset or restart. Now the first thing that you get to do when you get into the Windows Server operating system is set a password for the administrator account. Now you can set this to almost anything you like, but it's got to be a strong password, which I obviously didn't fulfill the first time. So then I have my other example and we're in. You want to sign in, you want to trust the network. Yeah, it's good. All right. The managing servers with Windows Admin Center is, I don't want it to pop up every time, so don't show this message again. Then you want to go to Manage, Add Roles and Features. You want to click Next, and you want a role-based or feature-based installation, because we're going to install a role. So under Server Roles, we're going to choose Hyper-V, and we want to install the management tools also, because that makes things a lot easier. Next, want to make sure it's no feature we want to install, which it isn't. So then we can just move along, and we don't want to create a virtual switch right now, otherwise we would check that box on the side there. We only have one server, so live migrations isn't an option for us. The default location for virtual hard disk files we want to change, because I want it under C:/ and then a folder called Hyper-V. And then of course you gotta make sure that it takes the name of Hyper-V, otherwise you gotta go in and rename the folder. Nothing strange about that. And then we also want to use that one for our virtual machine configuration files. We want to make sure everything's alright, that we've checked the right role, which we have. We have the management tools also, and then we just install. We can choose to automatically restart the server, but for this case we're not doing that. Then we want to restart. We want to choose why we're restarting the server. In this case it's application installation, and it was planned because we knew we want to install this role and that we needed to restart it. The reason to choose the reason is because if something fails and you go back into the logs and you see, the server rebooted. Okay, why did it reboot? Well, we don't know. Unspecified. That's not where you want to be eventually. So we restart the server, wait for it to boot up. When it's booted up, we just sign in. The server manager opens up automatically because we haven't told it not to. And then we have the Hyper-V role installed. If we go to Tools and Hyper-V Manager, we get to the place where we can actually manage our virtual machines or create them. On the left side we can see the name of our server. We didn't create a virtual switch in the installation process, so we're gonna have to do that by going to Virtual Switch Manager, and we're gonna choose an external and create virtual switch. We want to name it something exotic, like external. If you have multiple network interfaces, you can name them to different things just to be sure which one it is. For instance, if you have 3 network interfaces, you're connected to 3 different networks or switches, you can name them accordingly so that you know which one to use at what time. But we only have one, so we're going to make sure that that one is chosen. And since we only have one, we want to allow management operating system to share the network adapter. Otherwise, the host or the physical server won't be able to access the network. If you do have multiple network interfaces, you don't have to allow management for the same network interface that your virtual machine uses. You can have one specific for the host, and I would recommend using that one if you do have multiple, because then it's less likely that you would screw something up. And then we want to create a virtual machine. We're going to select a name. We're going to name it VM1 because it's easy. If we want to, we can store it in a different location, but we don't want to. Now, depending on what operating system you're installing, you can choose either generation 1 or generation 2. If you do install a Windows virtual machine, I'd recommend generation 2, unless it's an old operating system, say Windows 7 or Windows XP, which you shouldn't use anyway. Now, if you're installing a Linux virtual machine, then you might need to use generation 1, because I've noticed that some operating systems aren't compatible with generation 2. I don't know exactly which ones, because I haven't noted that, but I have come across virtual machines that can't install on a generation 2 if it's a Linux. But we'll choose a generation 2 for this one. Now, startup memory is how much RAM do you want to dedicate for the virtual machine when it boots up. If you're using dynamic memory, which means if you have, well, we're gonna get into that later, but if you have 8 gigs of RAM, you can specify that, well, this can use between 500 meg and 2 gigabytes of RAM. It can use up to 2 gigabytes of RAM, but if it doesn't need 2 gig at the moment, it won't use all that, and that, say it only uses 1 gig. Well, then you have 1 gig left for the others. So if it's possible, I recommend using dynamic memory. Some servers do require to have static memory assigned. Then you can select the amount of RAM right here at startup memory. But we're gonna give it 2 gigs of RAM, or 2048 megabytes. We want our virtual machine to be connected to the network, so we're going to choose the external virtual switch, and here we can create our virtual hard drive or hard disk. This is a dynamically expanding virtual hard disk, which means that if it only uses 20 gig, it will only use 20 gig of space. It can't grow past, well, in this instance, 20 gigs. But if it only needs 5, it will only use 5. Now, I don't have an ISO file to install Windows on this virtual machine, but if I did have an ISO file, this is where I would choose it to install the operating system. But we're not gonna install anything right now. But there we have our virtual machine. We can check the settings. We can check in which order it will boot from things, our network adapter, and we have our hard drive. We can choose to disable or enable secure boot, and here we can change our dynamic memory, the minimum and the maximum RAM. If we don't want to use dynamic, we can untick that box and just choose the amount of RAM we want to assign to it. If we have a server that requires a lot of processing power, we can assign multiple virtual processes. You gotta be aware of how many threads you have on your processor and how much RAM you have in your physical machine, because that is a limit. If you have 8 gigs of RAM, you can't assign 8 gigs of RAM to your virtual machines, because the host needs some RAM as well. With the processor, it's a little easier, because it can change and swap between who's getting access to the processor, but the RAM is more static. We can add multiple hard disks if we want, but we don't want to do that right now. And under automatic start action, we can choose what happens when the physical, when the host boots up, what happens to the virtual machine? Well, either nothing, but if it was running when the service stopped, so say for instance there's a power outage, the host goes down. When it comes back up, well, if the virtual machine was on, then it will be powered on again. Or you can choose to, well, this is a critical virtual machine that we always need running, and as soon as no matter if we took it down for maintenance or anything, if we power up the host, this server goes up as well. And then we can enter the console by simply double-clicking the virtual machine in the Hyper-V Manager, and then we get our little console and we can power it on. Now, something to note is that we have a few buttons. We have turn off, shut down, and save. Now, turn off, that's basically the same as just pulling the plug. If it was a physical machine, you would pull the plug. That's equal to turn off. Now, if you use shut down, it will tell the guest operating system in the virtual machine to shut down, and then you will have a graceful shutdown, which we want to use. And then you have save, that will basically just pause the machine in the state that it is. I don't recommend using save, but it is an option. Now, if there's anything you believe that I missed or that I should make a future video about, make sure to leave a comment down below. And if you liked this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you didn't like it, well, try playing it in double the speed. See if it makes it better or worse. And until I see you next time, have a good one. Bye!